November 9th, 1975. The air above Lake Superior is already beginning to sharpen, the late autumn light flickering through a shroud of low, restless clouds. Aboard the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, 29 men, deckhands, engineers, cooks, officers, move through their routines with the well-practiced choreography of a crew that has known 1,000 crossings. In the galley, Stevie Buck Hudson, the cook, flips strips of bacon on the hot griddle, their edges curling, sending up the scent of breakfast as footsteps thud overhead. Captain Ernest McSorley, his face lined from years of staring into wind and spray, reviews the weather forecast one last time in the wheelhouse. The printout from the weatherfax machine, its curled paper marked by smears of ink, shows a low-pressure system deepening to the west. Rain spatters the glass as First Mate John H. McCarthy squints at a navigation chart spread across the plotting table, his pencil ticking off the miles to Whitefish Bay. Metal groans softly underfoot as the loaded ore carrier lists ever so slightly against the chop, 26,116 tons of taconite pellets packed tightly in her holds, destined for the steel mills of Detroit. Outside, deckhands cinch their oilskins tighter against the wind, boots clanging on wet steel, faces stung by the icy spray thrown up as the ship plows eastward. The voice of the radio operator, Tom B. Edwards, crackles over the intercom, relaying a transmission from the nearby Arthur M. Anderson, reporting rising winds and a warning from the Coast Guard. A storm is coming. In the mess, mugs of coffee rattle as the ship pitches, and veteran sailors swap stories about gales past, laughter and nerves mingling, the camaraderie of men who understand the lake's moods. Near the stern, the engineer checks the temperature gauges on the roaring engines, his hands black with grease as he wipes them on a rag pulled from his pocket. All along the 729-foot length of the Fitzgerald, her orange lifeboats lashed tight to their davits, men go about their tasks, each action purposeful, precise, a ritual against the unknown. The lake, vast and indifferent, heaves beneath them, its surface darkening, seagulls wheeling low. There is no sense of impending doom, only the steady rhythm of work and the underlying respect for the power of Superior as the ship and her crew press onward into the gathering storm. In early November of 1975, as the days grew shorter and the northern winds began to carve icy furrows along the lakeshore, the city of Superior, Wisconsin braced itself for the shipping season's final, fevered push. The Edmund Fitzgerald, one of the mightiest freighters on the Great Lakes, sat moored at Burlington Northern's docks, her steel hull humming faintly with the echo of 1,000 footsteps and the steady clatter of conveyor belts. Dock workers, shrouded in thick wool coats and knit caps, moved with swift deliberation, their breath pluming in the frigid air as they loaded the Fitzgerald with over 26,000 tons of taconite pellets, iron ore, waiting to feed the hungry furnaces of Detroit. The weather was unsettled, a low leaden sky pressed down on the city and the harbor, and radio forecasts spoke of a November gale brewing somewhere to the northwest. In the taverns along Tower Avenue, mariners and their families exchanged uneasy glances over mugs of steaming coffee, the click of pocket radios punctuating conversations laced with equal measures of routine and apprehension. The Fitzgerald's crew, led by the seasoned Captain Ernest McSorley, moved methodically through their departure checks, their boots thudding on the steel deck, voices muffled by the wind and the ever-present hum of engines below. Children pressed their faces against frost-rimmed windows, watching the great ship as it prepared to slip away into the gathering gloom, while wives and mothers lingered on the shoreline, scarves drawn tight, eyes searching for some reassurance in the familiar silhouette. The loading was completed in the late afternoon, and the Fitzgerald's whistle echoed across the harbor, a low, mournful note that signaled not only her departure, but the weight of expectation that pressed in on every soul connected to the lake. The harbor master, clipboard in gloved hand, watched as the ship's massive lines were cast off, his notes smudged by sleet as he marked the time. The city itself seemed to hold its breath as the Fitzgerald began her slow journey out toward the open water, her bow slicing through the chop, steel gleaming wetly under the dim light. In that moment, as the storm gathered strength far out on the lake, the people of Superior felt the pressure of the season's end, a mixture of hope, fear, and resignation settling over them like the first cold snow. Within the modest, tightly knit communities hugging the windswept shores of Lake Superior, the night of November 10th, 1975, arrived like any other. Supper tables set with chipped dishes, radios crackling with the evening news, and families awaiting the return of loved ones from the water. In the living rooms of mariners' homes, the air was tinged with the familiar sense of damp wool and lake salt. Jackets hung near doorways, boots lined up in waiting. As dusk deepened, mothers and wives pressed their faces to cold window panes, searching the horizon for the faint beacon of a vessel's lights. On the main street of Whitefish Bay, a handful of locals gathered by the bulletin board outside the post office, sheltering from the wind, while inside the small wood-paneled tavern, sailors swapped stories beneath the glow of brass lanterns and the thrum of a jukebox. At the same hour, aboard the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, the crew moved through the narrow, steel-walled corridors, boots echoing along the ribbed deck as they checked hatches and braced cargo. The galley's aroma of reheated stew mingled with the metallic tang of lake air seeping from barely sealed doors. In the wheelhouse, Captain Ernest McSorley and his officers monitored the barometer as it dropped steadily, eyes darting between the rain-streaked windows and the radar's flickering screen. On the lower decks, the engine crew wiped grease from their hands, feeling the vibration of the turbines reverberate through the soles of their boots. As the wind howled louder, those in the crew's quarters exchanged quick words of reassurance, each acutely aware of the Fitz's reputation for resilience. Back in the towns, children were hushed and sent to bed early, their ears straining for the sound of their father's trucks crunching up gravel drives, the familiar clatter that brought peace at the end of every haul. But on this night, instead of the expected hum of engines, the wind carried only static, disrupted radio signals, and the faint unnerving suggestion of distress. The walls of ship and shore alike seemed to press inward, swelling with a collective worry that clung to every room, every hallway, every heart waiting in the dark for word from the storm-stalked lake. Night had already begun to press down upon Lake Superior on November 10th, 1975, as the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Arthur M. Anderson fought through the howling gale, their decks shuddering beneath wind gusts of nearly 80 miles per hour. Above the Fitzgerald, the sky was a torn banner of black, and the snow squalls were so dense that the ship's running lights flickered like distant ghosts in the void. Captain Ernest McSorley, wrapped in his Navy peacoat, stood on the bridge, tendrils of steam rising from his breath as he peered through the glass, streaked with freezing spray. The radio crackled between the two freighters, Anderson's Captain Cooper asking, "How are you making out with your problems?" and McSorley's calm but unmistakably tense reply, "We are holding our own." The Fitzgerald's bow plunged into mountainous waves, some reported by the Anderson's crew to crest above 25 feet, whose icy spray coated the rails and deck machinery with layers of brittle rime. Below, the deckhands checked the hatches, tightening the clamps and wiping away the snow with gloved hands numbed by the cold, while the constant jarring vibration of the engines reverberated through the steel hull. By 7:10 p.m., the Anderson's radar lost the Fitzgerald's blip as the two vessels approached the relative shelter of Whitefish Bay. The sound of the wind, the relentless thump of water against the hull, and the distant echoing groan of metal on metal filled the Fitzgerald's corridors. Moments before, Anderson's crew had glimpsed the Fitzgerald's lights one last time. A few minutes later, only darkness reigned where the 729-foot freighter should have been. A mayday never came. The Anderson's men picked up binoculars and searched the horizon, calling out positions and straining their eyes for any sign of the Fitzgerald through the blizzard's white fury. On the Anderson's bridge, Captain Cooper's fingers hovered over the radio microphone as he called again and again into the static, "Fitzgerald, this is the Anderson. Do you have your lights?" The only response was the hiss and pop of the storm. It was at that moment, as the Fitzgerald vanished from sight and signal, that the night's struggle changed, from a fight for survival to an unfolding disaster. The storm, implacable and indifferent, pressed on. The Fitzgerald, with her 29 men, was gone into the lake's icy depths. The search for answers, and for the ship itself, would now begin amid the wind and snow, their fates sealed in that irreversible instant. On a gray November morning in 1975, the icy wind that whipped across Lake Superior carried more than just the memory of the Edmund Fitzgerald's final voyage. It carried the voices of those left behind, echoing through grief and uncertainty. Within hours of the disappearance, families gathered at the Mariner's Mission in Duluth, waiting beneath flickering fluorescent lights and clutching coffee cups in trembling hands, the acrid scent of percolated coffee mingling with wet wool and cold air from the constantly opening door. The Coast Guard searchlights raked the churning water as snow began to fall, crews on rescue vessels straining their eyes for any sign of life or wreckage, sailors' oilskins shining under the lamps, breath fogging as they shouted over the wind. In the following days, telegrams arrived at shipping offices and union halls, simple words heavy with loss. No survivors found. The men's lockers at the ore docks in Detroit and Cleveland remained untouched, boots slumped beside lunch boxes that would never be opened again. In churches along Superior's shore, congregations gathered in silent vigil, prayers rising alongside the smoke of beeswax candles as ministers read the names of the 29 lost. Shipmates from the Fitzgerald sister vessels tied black armbands to their uniforms and stood at attention, hats removed, eyes lowered, at the sound of a bell tolled 29 times. Newsprint ink stained the fingers of townspeople as they read the headlines in the morning paper, stories that recounted the ship's last reported position, the battered hull's possible resting place, the mystery of its abrupt disappearance. In the months that followed, fishermen avoided the spot northeast of Whitefish Point, where floating debris, an orange life ring, a battered aluminum coffee pot, sometimes drifted ashore, mute relics bearing witness to the storm. Local folk musicians gathered in taverns and living rooms, guitars and mandolins cradled in calloused hands, voices weaving the tragedy into song, a living memorial that would be sung for decades. The echo of the Edmund Fitzgerald lingered not only in spoken memories or written words, but in the tightening of a sailor's grip on a hatch as November storms approached, and in the careful stowing of a family photograph deep within an oilskin coat pocket, a talisman against the lake's unpredictable fury. In these everyday acts, the tragedy was remembered, its lessons sewn into the fabric of Great Lakes life.